You're listening to Members of the Jury, the show that takes you straight into the trenches of justice, where the passion, players, and consequences are real. Each episode, we examine current events happening in the system. From the battles in courtrooms to the streets demanding reform, we bring those stories here to you, the members of the jury, because we aren't afraid to take it to the box.
Welcome back, members of the jury, and as always, happy Freedom Friday. I'm the creator host of the show, Deputy Public Defender Lucas Hursty, and thank you to everyone who is tuning in for the first time and to those who have had an opportunity to listen to prior episodes. If you can, please leave a review about the podcast on Apple Podcasts or on MOTJ, the link will be in the show notes, and share your favorite episode with a friend or family member. On today's show, we will be taking a policy issue to the box. When contemplating where to start efforts for criminal justice reform, there is a lot of different options because the criminal justice system has so many moving parts. But arguably, the most important part to reform is the place where the criminal justice system begins, and that's with the police. Over the last few years and decades, policing in America has been under a microscope, and for good reason. With the advancements of body-worn camera and smartphones, police interactions and encounters are being captured and scrutinized now more than ever. And as a society, we need to come together and realize that policing reform is needed. Today's guest is going to break down some of the issues that currently exist within the way that policing is being conducted in America, and he'll also propose some of the solutions on how to correct those issues. So, Feaster, please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
Hello, and thank you, Lucas, for having me. My name is Feaster. I'm a deputy public defender. I also used to be a senior policy advisor for the Board of Supervisors. And I'm excited to talk about this issue. Police reform is the reason why I went to law school and why I wanted to be a public defender.
Well, let's start off right there, Feaster. Why do you think that criminal justice reform and starting with police reform is the first place? Why is that a good starting place?
Starting off with the police, I believe, is the most influential part in the criminal justice reform. They are the individuals who are interacting and helping or hurting clients that are on the street. Law enforcement has the ability to fundamentally change our criminal justice system. Whether it's the stop and frisk policies, whether it's their policies with consensual encounters, whether it's their enforcement of minor traffic violations, they have an immense amount of power and authority over our community. And they can yield and wield this power for good, or as we've seen nationwide, unfortunately, to the detriment of communities of color.
I totally agree. One of the reasons why I think starting with police reform is so important to criminal justice reform as a whole is because, to me, they yield the power of arrest by probable cause. And that is single-handedly the thing that strips most people away of their presumption of innocence. Because once you have that stripped away and you're arrested and you go through court proceedings, some jurors respect the rule of law and they give you that presumption of innocence. Others do not. You have to prove that the police were wrong, that the government is wrong. And so the notion of probable cause, all it takes is to strip an individual. And what we've seen in America since its inception is that communities of color have had that presumption stripped away from them by probable cause at more rates than their counterparts, right? So much so that there's been, literature and scientific studies that refer to the broken window theory or over policing of communities and colors. For our members of the jury listening, can you give them an insight as to what those theories are ultimately getting at?
These studies that you've mentioned have only confirmed, solidified what I was taught as a young boy dealing with law enforcement. It's the same thing my father was taught by his grandfather, and we can trace it all the way back to slavery. In each and every study, every year, what it shows is that unfortunately, Black people are searched, detained, and arrested at higher rates than their counterparts. And the reality is, this studies also show that despite them being searched at higher rates, they're not finding more higher amounts of contraband or illegal substances.
One of the things you mentioned about how policing and over policing in community of colors is the notion of just being stopped and frisked. Why don't you explain a little bit more about, what that is and why it's so essentially offensive?
Stop and frisk, I believe, goes hand in hand also with consensual encounters. And I believe both of those components play a major role in the over policing of communities of color. And in both instances, law enforcement can pull over someone for a minor traffic violation, such as their tags being expired. Once their person is pulled over to the side of the road for that, the officer then is legally allowed to ask the individual to step outside the vehicle. And then for their quote unquote own safety, they can pat down that individual. Then they begin asking all these questions on whether you're on probation, whether you're on parole. And then it follows up with, is there, can I search your vehicle? And this routinely happens on very minor violations, whether it's your registration being expired, whether it's jaywalking, whether it's had individuals just at the mall sitting down on a bench and law enforcement coming up saying, "Hey, what's your name? Are you on probation or parole?" And it's not as if they're responding to an emergency. There was no 911 call. There was no one in distress, right? What they're doing, and technically what they're allowed to do, unfortunately, is to stop, detain, and search individuals that they feel that they want at their own leisure. And what happens, what the data has shown us, is that over years and years and decades, is that this power that they've been given has been exercised, I would say, at higher rates for persons of color versus their counterparts.
What do you say to the counter argument to those who would argue that, well, they do find contraband, they do find drugs, they do find weapons in these communities that are plagued with high crime rates, and so these stop and frisk acts should happen because that is what's getting the drugs and the guns off the streets?
Outside, we can start at the Fourth Amendment. You're right, to be free from unlawful searches and seizures, which is in the U.S. Constitution. Outside of that, we can start looking at, you mentioned drugs, and it's communities of color and communities that are more affluent, that are, I'll say, white communities. They use drugs all at the same rate. It's not one community is using more drugs than the other. No, what ends up happening, what data has shown us, is that despite communities using drugs at the same rate, communities of color and Black individuals are being stopped for the same drug at higher rates. So despite them using it at the same rate, they're not going to jail at the same rate. The individuals going to jail are those who are poor, those who are communities of color.
I think the focal point, too, should be that one of the biggest frustrations that I have since being involved in the criminal justice system is talking to people who engage in criminal behavior, but because they've never been caught or convicted or sent to jail, they somehow act as if they're not doing that. Drugs is a perfect example. How many people who have indulged in any kind of illicit drug, even once, is essentially a drug user and would subject themselves to jail or prison or arrest, you name it, just in being involved in the system. But if they don't actually get processed, they snub their nose down at those who do get, as if they're somehow less human, if somehow they have less rights. And I've always thought that that's the biggest issue. And one of the reasons why you are seeing that is due to this notion of over policing in communities of colors, because you have these law enforcement agencies just almost like lying in waiting for an opportunity to just potentially capture someone committing a crime.
And I think it's what I agree with you. What you're saying is lying in wait. They're literally looking and searching for any small violations or any violation of the penal code. And what happens is, in communities of color, is that a lot of these communities aren't as affluent. What I mean by that is they don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the supermarkets. They don't have the parks. They don't have the street lights. They don't have the roads. They don't have the jobs. And so while both communities, communities of color,
Well, they also don't have the security guard at the front, the gated community,
yes, yes, yes.
you know what I mean? Because at the same time, like if you would take the same number of law enforcements that are patrolling communities of colors to quote unquote make them safe, that same number of law enforcements in an affluent community would be unacceptable. There would have to be an ongoing emergency for those communities to accept, multiple police there patrolling all times of the day.
And we have to get away from this fallacy of the idea of this premise that if you increase law enforcement in a community, that will equal safety in that community. That's a false premise, and that's false. And it's been proven. We're not actually addressing the underlying problem, which is poverty, and why we're not actually investing. Because, like you said, in other communities, you have gates, you have security guards, you have all these individuals and all these infrastructure where law enforcement, they're not going into a gated community. If you have a doorman in front of your apartment, they're not going up into the apartment. They're not going to be able to see that in the person doing drugs. They're not going to see all of that. They're also not going to have as many individuals who are experiencing homelessness because they're actually investing in that community compared to the most of the communities of color where they're not actually investing in. And then you have signs of poverty, which we unfortunately have criminalized and allowed law enforcement to then do what they have been trained to do, which is stop, detain, and arrest.
Obviously, we've talked about how the existence of over policing in these communities of color by way of stop and frisk, minor traffic violations, and consensual encounters or searches, those lead to the tension and stops in these encounters with the police and these people of color or just anybody within those certain community, whether it be impoverished as well. And oftentimes, as the statistics show, there isn't contraband, there isn't weapons, the people aren't on any kind of supervision, and yet there's still some kind of case that comes out of it because there's a lack of, or there is an existence of escalation and use of force. And so let me ask this, how does that situation present an issue when there isn't even contraband that's found?
I think you mentioned, and I'll answer your question. You mentioned this person isn't even on probation or parole. I believe even if you're on probation or parole, the act of, if you have a Fourth Amendment waiver and the police can search you at any time, that act of pulling the person out of the car, sitting them down on the curb, or putting them in the back of the police car, just dumping their vehicle, dumping their person, dumping their house is traumatizing. And when they find nothing, this trauma does not just go away when, okay, oh, you're free to leave. It's still with you. And so the next interaction you have in law enforcement is probably not going to be positive. You're probably going to be upset. You're definitely, especially if this is the same officer that's been harassing you time and time again. And so when you talk about the escalation, I think part of it is just the training. And I've seen the good side of it. I've seen officers really use de-escalation when an individual is upset, probably rightfully so upset, sometimes just not rightfully upset. They're upset for no reason. But I believe it's the officer, it's the person who's trained and who's employed to do this job that should have the tools and should use the tools to actually, I'm not going to escalate the situation by getting louder than you or using more force. I'm actually going to de-escalate. I'm going to see how I can make this situation toned down and trying to solve this without using any force. And I believe that is something that the community has been demanding more recently, and that will really change with the use of force that individuals are using. Even if an individual is mad that you're pulling them over, that you're searching me, if an officer uses de-escalation techniques, if they're not meeting disrespect or perceived disrespect with further disrespect, I think that can go further in actually solving and actually building trust within the community.
That's really key.
And I say this, as public defenders, I think we have experience in de-escalation. When you're talking to a client who's yelling and mad, we know that returning fire with fire is probably not actually going to solve anything, right? You're not going to get whatever you're actually looking for, right? So maybe listening to that person and then responding with respect, maybe a little empathy, understanding why they're upset. And that you're always going to be, and that always, at least in my experience, my practice, I always get better results doing that than just responding with anger, even if I'm 100% correct and that person is wrong. Responding with fire and just escalating it solves nothing.
To your last point, I think one of the key in police reform that's really needed is the building back of trust between the community and the police, and false stops and unwarranted fishing expeditions for the possibility of finding crime. Like, that's not the way to do it. And putting an end to those stops essentially could have a better impact not only on the community as a whole, but on that community police relationship, because I think there's always a small sense of fear anytime a person, regardless of gender, race, or creed, there's always a sense of fear anytime they have interactions with the police
100%.
because of the amount of power a police officer yields. Like, no matter what, like, a person always has to be somewhat on their toes, even when they're not doing anything wrong or haven't done anything wrong, because everything is based on an officer's perception. And so, their ability to arrest, to shoot, to use force, like, all of that really lies on a whim based on their perception. And some of these officers, unfortunately, have long, traumatic, or short and horrific just experiences that lead them to perceive certain things and individuals a certain way that then negatively affect the experience of the person that they're engaging with, and then that has a whole effect on the relationship at large. So I think that's obviously an issue that's been occurring in America for years on end.
I'll tell you this, Lucas. Growing up, my experience is it's not unique to just me. I think all of my friends who are Black have done this. Their parents, their dad, mother, grandmother, grandfather have always had the talk, and they're telling them what to do when you're contacted by police. And and I'm going to have it with my daughter as well. It's just to get home. I don't care if if you're right or if they're wrong, doesn't matter. We just want you to get home and be safe. And that fear that you mentioned, no matter where I'm at, this has been since high school, college, law school, all the way through up to this day. Law enforcement's near me. They're behind me while I'm driving. They're in the room. I know where they're at. It's a sense, like you said, anxiety of I don't know what's going to happen. And it's fear. And this fear is not just from myself. You can probably call it post-traumatic stress. Watching over and over and over your friends, yourself, shoot what happens on cameras and all the videos. It's traumatizing seeing people that look like you, people that could be you, right? Being killed, hurt, tased, arrested for no reason. And even if they do have a reason, using excessive force.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know obviously not being personally affected, but having extremely close, friends, people that I consider family, directly affected. I mean, and directly affected in my presence. Like, that's also been extremely passionate of mine, and reason why I wanted to become not only a criminal defense attorney, but public defender. A story I've always shared that's connected me to being a public defender, and what I told in my application was, I remember being a 13-year-old hanging out with, a mosh pit group of friends, Hispanic, a Cambodian, a African American, and a mixed individual, and we were all together and hanging out when 3 squad cars pulled up on a summer night at like midnight when we were outside of one of our friends' house, and made us all line up and call our parents to eventually come get us. But one of the officers felt it was necessary to put the flashlight in my Black friend's face, and amongst all of us, even though we were all doing the exact same thing and clearly a group of friends, asked my Black friend, and only my Black friend, well, you look like a criminal, don't you? And I just knew in my mind that was wrong. And I was so confused as to why the police officer would think that, if anything, we were all should have been asked that question, or none of us should have been asked that question. And so, I really am fortunate to be in the position where I am now, to be able to, fight against these injustices on a daily basis. And it's a pleasure to do so with you every single day as we address these issues and fight against them.
I agree, and I think we really underestimate that 13-year-old boy who was told, "You look like a criminal, don't you?" That impact, how that stays with him for the rest of his life, and how that will then now turn his perception of all law enforcement on how, what to expect and why you're going to be scared. And this is not been addressed. And I think so I'm happy to be here and talk about this.
Absolutely. And so I think we've done an amazing job as to highlighting, at least one of the essential issues that exist in current policing practices. And that's just the over policing that exists within communities of colors. How stop and frisk, minor traffic violations, and consent searches can lead to just unwarranted and unnecessary encounters, which has a complete breakdown in trust that then exists within those communities. And I've never met a single person who has advocated for a society of anarchy and chaos. Okay. I've never met a real life joker, to my knowledge, even though I've met a bunch of abolitionists and, defund the policers. And I get a lot of their arguments. And I think at the end of the day, they all strive for the end thing, but none of it ever surrounds anarchy and control. And so, I guess, Feaster, why don't you explain to the members of the jury how calling for a police reform is drastically different than calling for a elimination of policing and just a chaos and anarchy society?
I mean, I'll speak for myself. I just want to be policed. I want our communities to be policed like other communities. I want to be treated the same. Right? I want to be treated just like the rich communities, like the people, like my counterparts. I don't want to be treated special because of my color, because you have these stereotypes. And Black community and communities of color, I believe they need, and they're not saying we want zero police. No, we want police, right? But we want them to do their job and not kill us, not hurt us, not harm us. We want them to actually help us when we are calling for help for a child who is potentially mentally ill, or we're asking for help for a certain situation. When we call for help, we don't want something worse to happen when they actually get there to the scene. And it's really that simple as we want our communities to be policed the same way as the affluent, rich communities.
And that would just have an overall better effect on the criminal justice system. I mean, you wouldn't have as many people going into jail for petty drug crimes that all genders, communities, and creeds use. Statistically, we know this, like drug usage on a personal use level is used by all people, all genders, at around the same amount. But the fact that we have such a disproportionate, number of incarcerated people of color for low-level drug offenses just shows how over-policing can have an effect. Whereas most of the people don't get caught, they think it's okay to do, but the moment an individual does get caught and is deemed a convict, like they're somehow less of a person and deserve less rights. And so that is one of the overarching collateral damages of over policing. And then Feaster just touched on another big one, and honestly a more important one, and that's that oftentimes these encounters then lead to use of force, which then can either cause whole other charges when the individual would have never been charged otherwise, or in the worst and extreme situations lead to acts of violence, not only against potentially and unfortunately an officer, but the person who was then, in our eyes, wrongfully stopped to begin with over a perceived threat that then ensued. And so I think if you look at all of the data that's out there, there's certainly articles that suggest that Black and Latinos are stopped way more than whites, yet aren't found with any substantial more contraband, or that they are almost 200 times more likely to be pulled over in certain jurisdictions. That just doesn't present any more fruitful results. And so we're going to move forward with, after identifying this issue of over policing in America, it can be addressed. It can be fixed. There are solutions available that can start a reform process that can have a greater purpose to the system. I think one of those, and Feaster, I'd have you explain that, the use of banning certain restraints and enforcing actual de-escalation policies. What would that look, and what kind of effect would it have?
I think before we even get to the policies, right, if we are to really take any meaningful police reform, it will have to take a change in ideology on both camps. It's one camp saying that Blue Lives Matter, right, and we support our local law enforcement, and the other side of saying that all cops are bad. And it's a us versus them mentality, whereas no matter what either side does, I'm staying in my camp and you are wrong and you need to fix it. And the other side is doubling down saying, no, I'm not changing, you have to change. And this is where we're in the stalemate that we're in. And as we move forward to even the de-escalation and the restraint, the chokehold restraint, that only has come afoot because of the pressure put on by activists and individuals in our communities asking and demanding for change. And unfortunately, it only comes after there's video evidence of what just happens to be another Black person dying at the hands of law enforcement. And it's unfortunate that it takes acts of violence, it takes murder to actually change, to put pressure on law enforcement. And I believe the de-escalation is a step in the right direction. And I mentioned it, de-escalation will fundamentally change it will change, but we need to do a better job of training it. And then our officers using that training in their day-to-day practice, their day-to-day activities as they patrol.
As sad and unfortunate as the George Floyd trial was, I thought it served as a really great opportunity to kind of showcase to America and put on trial to America some of the fundamental issues that are universally taught in policing. Some of these restraints, some of these tactics and techniques of how and when to use of force is able. I think it highlighted that what is being taught and what's out there, and it shocked the conscience of a lot of people, because we did subsequently the outright mandate and ban of certain restraints.
I would say this: I think it shocked the conscience of. I don't think it shocked the conscience really of communities of color in the Black community. We've seen this, unfortunately, over and over and over and over and over again. But I believe on the nationwide scale, right, in all communities, you've seen just plain view 4K, you've seen their police training, how they're trained and how that's actually used in practice, right? And you see a person actually dying on video, crying out for their mother, and the lack of concern of anything, void of all emotions. And I believe, like you said, I think it shocked probably the conscience of our nation saying that's wrong. And it's unfortunate that it takes something that blunt and that explicit to do that. Whereas I believe there's been countless other examples that I thought could have done that. This looked like the catalyst to actually begin the train for change.
I don't think the use of force that was displayed, despite the level of aggression, shocked the conscience, especially in communities of colors. I do think, though, people have known that police do use force, and that they get away with it by either being charged or, if then barely charged, getting acquitted. But I think what shocked the conscience of a lot of people, even in potentially communities of colors, was the notion is that you have national experts who had the credibility and the gall to go on stand on a nationally televised trial and argue that some of these restraints that are used not only are okay, but are acceptably taught as like a standard of care and practice that needed to be implemented. Like, that was shocking, that like cops were trained that like you need to use this level of force. And like, I understand what they do is a very risky and dangerous job, and I'm very grateful that there are, me personally, grateful that there are police officers out there, because that's not a job that I would ever want to assume the risk to do. But at the same time, that sole assumption of risk doesn't allow you to then just proactively act in almost vigilante form.
I agree there, and I think what we've seen in this trial, what's unique, I would say, is that you had his own supervisors, his own training officers coming saying, "This is not what he's been trained. This is unacceptable. We have never trained him on this before." Contrary, and I think that's different in other police officer trials, which there hasn't been many. They have all stood behind and said, "No, this is their training and experience." And I think that's really the difference. I think that I've seen in this trial, and really started propelling the movement for change. It's still moving slow, but it's baby steps, I guess.
Well, we just talked about how there was a certain policy change that kind of swept through the country as it related to the use of force and de-escalation policies. But I also want to talk about, for young advocates who may be listening, or people who want to also implement change in their communities, there's aspect of proposals that they can utilize that would aim to reduce law enforcement presence in communities of color and address policing and police violence. So what are some recommendations that you think should be advocated for to help overall fix those issues?
I think there are actual policies that are out there. I think the number one and foremost, first and foremost recommendation I would give to young activists is to support and endorse candidates for political office that will actually change and be willing to take on the fight to actually change some of these policies at their local sheriff, their local police department. Because without that, if you don't have the support of these elected officials, it is an uphill battle getting them to actually move on anything. And I know one of the proposals that I've seen in my jurisdiction is banning the use of stop and frisk and consensual encounters and pretextual stops. And what I mean by that is an officer approaching an individual who is doing nothing wrong and just asking them, "Are you on probation or parole? Or do you mind if I search you?" Right? "Oh, what's your name?" And then they use their name to go then and run to see if they have any warrants, to see if they have can I search them? Though what this ordinance is trying to do is to stop the unnecessary and unwarranted searches and detentions of individuals, right? And if there's, for example, a minor traffic violation, this ordinance would then prevent that officer. If you're getting pulled over for registration being expired, it will prevent that officer from then asking, "You mind if I search you and search your car for drugs?" If if there is no other evidence pointing to drugs being in that car, the officer should not then be allowed to ask, let alone actually search the vehicle.
I agree. I think that it would definitely be a great implementation to police reform. That maybe if, as a society, we want their potential presence to serve as a deterrence, although I don't personally think that works, then maybe that's fine. But their ability to actually take action and to potentially go on these fishing expeditions needs to end. I've seen that certain counties across the country have started to flirt with this notion of potentially, no encounters or interaction at all for minor traffic violations. Right? There's plenty of advancements in technologies now, especially, you go to the Bay Area, every bridge that you cross is used with cameras, and then you get a ticket in the mail, whether you paid for your fare or you didn't. And so the same notion could apply to minor traffic violations if an officer gets the license plate.
Outside of emergencies, maybe someone who's driving, recklessly. I believe that's something that armed law enforcement do not need to handle. Right? It's not an emergency, and it's putting them at unnecessary risk. Granted, if there's someone's excessively speeding, if they're driving without your lights at night, that's a danger to everyone, and that person should be stopped. But there's a lot of these. "Oh, you didn't use your turning signal for 100 yards before turning. Your license plate tags are expired." Those are things that could be handled administratively.
Yeah, your license plate light wasn't illuminated,
That was my first time I was pulled over.
Your windshield was cracked. Like, so many of the smallest detail, you straddled the lane for a moment, like the smallest detail, And oftentimes the craziest things is that then there's not even a citation for that violation that led to the encounter in the first place. And so to me, that just highlights, we can just get rid of them, right? Like if you're not even ultimately going to give a cite, like it can't be that important. And sometimes, yeah, the cite wouldn't matter because you found a car full of drugs or weapons and it was all worth it. But especially if you pull that person over and then nothing comes of it, like it just shows that it was unnecessary to begin with. That leads me to the next thing that I think from a policy reform stance could also have a better effect on the policing and overall trust within the community. And that would be the decriminalization of low-level offenses and the investment in non-law enforcement interventions. Can you explain to the members of the jury what kind of policy change that would look like?
I think it's accepting the premise and fundamentally changing the way we look at drugs and mental health is that, number one, our jails are not equipped nor able to handle, nor is it the best place for individuals suffering addiction. It's not the best place to handle those who are mentally ill. An individual who is picked up for possession of a controlled substance, some illegal drug, is put in jail for anywhere from 5 to, I think, up to a year in custody. When that person gets out, they will still be addicted to said drug. And what we've shown and what we're trying to show, and I think jurisdictions have done this, at least throughout California, is that there are other alternatives to help this person who's suffering from addiction than jail. And this isn't something that I don't believe law enforcement actually went to the academy to do, to write tickets for drugs. That's not helping anyone, right? We want to what jurisdictions are doing and what our jurisdiction is starting to do is to get individuals who are trained and who want to help this individual beat their addiction by getting them into residential treatment program, by getting them connected to services, by trying to get them off the street. And when we shift to definitely mental health, it is law enforcement, unfortunately, are simply not trained nor the best fit to help individuals who are experiencing mental health issues, right? We need trained individuals, trained professionals who are able to talk to this person, to de-escalate this situation, to then get this person connected with services, or maybe to get this person connected to whatever they're looking for. And oftentimes what we see, and I know I've seen in my practice, is a mother calling the law enforcement, calling 911, saying, my son, my daughter, she's off her meds and she needs help, right? She's diagnosed with said disease and they need help. Please come. Unfortunately, they don't have the tools to actually help this person, and they get charged with resisting arrest. They get charged with battery. They get charged with possession of a controlled substance, and it's taken to jail. And at the end of the day, what this mother and what this father, what they want for their child is not jail, is a hospital, right? They want their child to be on medicine and on medication. I think that's where we're moving, where we're not going to call law enforcement to handle these situations. They're going to be called for emergencies, for more life and death situations. And these situations will be left to mental health clinicians, social workers, doctors, and start treating addiction and mental health as what they are, public health crisis, and not an actual criminal crisis.
And I think as far as officer safety is concerned, you would be increasing officer safety. Officers would no longer have to deal with potential, low-level homeless drug addicts who are in a high state, who are acting erratic as they were just to be left alone. They wouldn't have to deal with potentially dirty needles or other diseases that.
Nor do they want to deal with it.
Yeah, nor do they want to. But I'm just saying, like it would eliminate that need to have to. And you named it too, especially as it relates to the mental health. Like I get that people who suffer from mental health can still present a threat, can still present a violent threat, but the first response, or not necessarily the first, but it shouldn't be a quick response to then match that potential threat or that potential use of violence by a person suffering from mental health illness. Shouldn't be to match that with force or match that with the violence.
You need specialized trained how to de-escalate. De-escalation with a person not experiencing mental health is different than someone who's been diagnosed with said illness. And that's where you need professional training to see we can handle this, right? And I've never seen, at least in my practice or my colleagues, where a person is some type of states with said mental illness, and an armed police officer shows up, and it always ends up worse. They're just simply not trained to handle that. And coming with an armed response and being, authoritative and being aggressive, it's just escalating the situation. Instead of de-escalating to see how they can help, to see how I can get this person maybe out of the house and services that they were looking for.
Yeah, and again, I think it just protects the officers from being able to have less of a workload or of responsibility that they do, because they do have such a high stress job. If there are moments and encounters and situations where we can dispatch other professionals with non-lethal options, I think that would be ideal. So one of the last policy reforms that I think could help increase policing reform as a whole is a notion of a community-led oversight commission with certain powers that basically oversees policing in communities across the country. So can you explain to the members of the jury what does that look like, and ultimately what powers should they be able to have?
The idea of a community review board, community oversight of a law enforcement, is essentially, if an incident occurs and you want to file a complaint, right, you can file a complaint with the community-led review board. That review board, and what they're trying to do and what I've been seeing, is we'll have subpoena power, we'll have investigative powers, we'll have the ability to investigate said incident, subpoena some of the records of the law enforcement personnel, and then after the investigation, make a determination of what happened. Is it sustained? Are the allegations of this complaint found true? Or are they not? And then on top of that, this community oversight board then can make recommendations to the actual body, right? To the sheriff or to the police department, to the police chief, to actually fix whatever problem has been going on. And I think that is going to be the way, number one, as I talked about, to rebuild trust. And you can't rebuild trust without accountability. I think the lack of accountability is the reason why the community is still upset and they're demanding change. Is something will happen, something will be recorded, and nothing happens. They go on administrative leave, and then it's just they're back on duty like nothing happened. And if we are ever to build trust and actually have the communities of color and communities in general really trust law enforcement to get, work hand in hand, you have to be accountable. You have to, if someone messes up, that person has to be held accountable. And I think currently that's what's missing. And that's why we don't have that trust, that we don't have that accountability.
And implementing a community-led oversight commission would also help with transparency. And I think transparency is also a very big component in trust and building trust, and them having the ability to do some internal reviews and see things otherwise they wouldn't be privy to, I think shows that there's an extending hand that is willing to build that trust. And I totally understand having your colleagues back and having certain things scrutinized when maybe they shouldn't be. I totally get that. But there needs to be a level of equality, and it can't be one-sided for them or against them.
And I believe this will take time. You can create a community oversight review board. The trust will not be created, just be there magically over a day. This relationship has been terrible. It's been breaking down for decades and decades and generations. So rebuilding that trust, right? Rebuilding that bridge will take time as well. And like you said, it has to be transparent, has to be accountable. And just like in any profession, us as attorneys, my doctor, my barber, if we mess up, we will be accountable to the state bar. If my doctor messes up, right, they can be accountable to their bar. They can be accountable to their oversight committee. My barber messes up, they can be accountable to their board. And it's the community, how you rebuild that trust is, like you said, is that if someone messes up, right, that person will be held accountable by some oversight committee that will then determine a punishment or the removal. And it's paramount in all professions that we have. It's normal, but for law enforcement, that's the only profession where you could potentially lose your job for messing up in one city and then move to another city and just pick up like nothing happened. That is a problem. And that is where communities get upset, and you don't have that accountability, you don't have that trust.
That is a big thing that I think should be implemented as well as it relates to policing in America. This national accountability license, malpractice insurance, and it just so much incentive to do good and to not lose it. So I really appreciate you coming on the show, Feaster. And we've talked about some of the issues that exist in communities of color and the problem that over policing those communities present. We've highlighted some of the basic issues and ways in which traumatic issues happen. And we've also proposed some simple yet effective solutions that I hope are insightful to others and encourage them to and incentivize them to reach out to their local politicians to help fight for these change, to increase the bans on restraints, to maximize the number of de-escalation policies used. And at the end of the day, it isn't fighting for a society of anarchy. It's fighting for equality, for the same fair treatment under the rule of law that, even though when it was initially designed in this country, wasn't for every person of every race, every gender, every creed, but now is, and we're fighting for that every single day, and we'll continue to do so until it happens. And so, Feaster, before we let you go, you did take this matter to the box today, but why don't you explain to the members of the jury, what does the concept and the notion of taking matters to the box mean to you?
In my eyes, taking issues to the box is the only way to get change. This is an issue, police reform has been an issue that's been plaguing this country since the inception, right? For decades and decades and generations. And things will only change by taking them to the box, by bringing these issues up to forefront and making them known how we can be better. How can we become a more perfect nation, right? And it's by equality, by accountability, by transparency, and just admitting what has happened and how we can move forward.
Well, members of the jury, that's our show, and I rest my case. Be sure to come back next episode as we take another matter to the box. If you're a fan of the show, go ahead and subscribe. You can also find us on social media at Members of the Jury. If you want to be a guest or have any feedback, be sure to email us at lhursty@membersofthejurypod.com. The information in this podcast is provided as general reference work as a public service. The audience is advised to check for changes to current laws and to consult with a qualified attorney on any legal issue. The use of this material does not create an attorney-client privilege in any fashion with the podcast, the host, or the guest. This information is for educational purposes only, and no one affiliated with the podcast may be held liable for any decision made based on this information.